We're now beginning our series of videos on Napoleon Bonaparte and the age of Napoleon, which we could say is from roughly 1795 until his defeat in 1815. And I want to look particularly at his rise to power in this video installment. And very generally, we could say that there are sort of three sort of abstract reasons for Napoleon's rise to power. And this would be some combination of the three elements of one. Luck. Napoleon was the first to admit he had sort of a lucky star. He was just one of those people who had luck on his side. Whether that being at the right place at the right time, as we've said, happens many times during his life, or whether that is a stroke of luck on the battlefield, knowing that exact moment to send the bulk of his military into the left flank, right flank, or center of the enemy, whatever it may be, whatever battle it may be, at just the right moment, and ultimately winning the battle, and often against superior numbers. And two, the element of genius to Napoleon, both in his talent and his abilities. Again, his ability to sort of compartmentalize his brain to focus on large government problems or military matters, or dealing with very small issues such as orphanages in Paris. Even while on campaign, he was still writing orders directly to people back in Paris and in France on the management of schools, the more secure relationship between his empire and the Catholic Church, which had largely been, remember, lost during the French Revolution. And so all of these things was his own sort of genius. And the third thing is the element of propaganda. Napoleon knew how to use propaganda very well. He used imagery. Many of the portraits and paintings you've seen so far on these videos, many of them were ordered by Napoleon to show, as we'll soon see, sort of victory on a battlefield, or the image of him on a beautiful white horse crossing the Alps in his beautiful uniform, and all these sorts of things. Things that didn't exactly happen that way, but it was a nice image. And so we will see in this video certainly how he used propaganda to his benefit. So those are sort of three of the major things. But I'll give you four specific examples, or four specific events that lead to Napoleon's rise, ultimately to becoming more or less dictator of France in 1799. So where we left off, we sort of said Napoleon went through these various military academies as a young man, and at the age of 15, he was accepted to the Royal Military Academy in Paris, basically the best of the best, in which he was set on the path of becoming an officer in the artillery. And at this time, artillery were mainly just cannons. And the French artillery pieces were at the vanguard of artillery in Europe. They were the best. In a later video, we'll talk specifically about why they were so good. But basically, he became a lieutenant, and having his own artillery regiment at a very young age. And once the Revolutionary Wars began against Austria and Prussia, he found himself engaged in those wars and moving up very quickly. Again, he could move up quickly because he had a noble title. And the revolution, although it was trying to get rid of that, ultimately had to rely on any noble that was willing to fight to lead men, and Napoleon was one of them. And he gained, let's say, the attention of some of the leaders of the revolution. Remember the Jacobins. Particularly, he caught the eye of the brother of Maximilian Robespierre. His name was Augustin Robespierre. And the military was often relied upon by whether it was Robespierre or later the Directory, in order to put down any sorts of revolts against the revolution, particularly in the area of France known as the Vendée, whatever it may be. And so he caught their eye, and he was certainly loyal to the Jacobins. So at the tender age of 24, he was given command of the artillery of France's army of Italy. This would be the army that was preparing to invade Italy, which was then controlled by the Austrians, and try to remove them completely from northern Italy. And that's going to come into play here in a minute. But I would say the number one thing that leads to Napoleon's rise to absolute power are the events of October 3rd, 1795, in which, of course, the Directory is ruling by this point, and there are royalists, right, nobles who have declared a rebellion against the National Convention. They have weapons, and they are heading towards the center of the city, the center of Paris. And so there's sort of this royalist mob. And the Directory basically asked Napoleon Bonaparte if he would handle this. He says, yes, of course I will. And he lines up his artillery along a road there where the royalist mob is going to have to pass as they make their way into the center of Paris. And he basically uses just a handful of cannons, artillery pieces, and orders them, his men, to shoot artillery into this crowd, which, again, there would have been a lot of even people who were pro-revolution who in that moment would not have been able to fire on their fellow Frenchmen, even if it was a royalist mob. Not only did Napoleon fire on them, but he fired cannon at them. And basically one round of this killed about some 1,400 royalists. And they got the message very quickly, and they dispersed, ran away in the opposite direction, and Napoleon was seen as the protector of the revolution from sort of that point on. And that gave him an unbelievable amount of attention from the National Convention, fame, again, sort of seen as this protector of the revolution, wealth and patronage from the new government structure of the Directory, of which, as I said, he becomes one of the 5 members. So that's no doubt one of the major parts of his rise to power. The second is, again, he was given that command of the army of Italy. And in 1796, so began the Italian campaign, in which the French, largely led by Napoleon, invaded the Austrian-held parts of Italy. Napoleon led his army, and defeated the Austrians at almost every turn, and even took the Papal States with Rome. He beat the Austrians so bad that they were basically forced to negotiate peace. And this made him an absolute hero back in France, a military hero, and someone that certainly the Directory could count on. He not only defeated the Austrians, but he himself negotiated the peace terms, which was very important. And the peace terms were written in the so-called Treaty of Campo Formia in 1797, in which Austria gave up major parts of its empire, including the Austrian Netherlands, which went directly into for the French Empire, and northern Italy was turned into these so-called sister republics, but they were basically now a part of the French Empire. And following that, both Austria and Prussia ended their war with the French. The only person, or the only country, I should say, that still stood in Napoleon's way at that point was that of Great Britain, who sort of refused to end their war with Napoleon. They wanted to see this guy gone and a monarchy reestablished. Napoleon, as I said, returned to Paris a national hero for what he had done. He had just created huge gains for the French Empire and defeated the Austrians. So the question was now, how do we basically attack the British and get them to stop this war with us? And Napoleon knew that the French Navy was in no way could it handle taking on the British Royal Navy. So it wasn't going to happen at sea, and there was no way they could invade England. So Napoleon decided on the invasion of Egypt, where the British controlled the Suez Canal, which allowed them their very important trade with India particularly, but other parts of the world. And so he wanted to disrupt trade with India and hurt the British economy. So in the year 1798, he began the so-called Egyptian campaign, where he led his army across the Mediterranean and into Egypt. He was almost immediately met by the military rulers of Egypt at that time, who were called the Mamelukes, and they were oppressive to the Egyptian people. And Napoleon took them on in a battle known as the Battle of the Pyramids in 1798, where he laid a sound defeat on them and now basically controlled Egypt. However, almost immediately, all of the ships that were in the harbor that the French had used to get to Egypt were sacked or destroyed by the British Navy in the so-called Battle of the Nile, where they were led by Britain's greatest naval officer, Horatio Nelson. So the British destroyed the French troops' way to get back home. Therefore, they were trapped in Egypt. Napoleon tried to then invade parts of the Ottoman Empire into Syria, which were not successful, and he returned to Egypt. Many men were dying from disease, and he realized if he was going to be able to turn this situation around, he needed to get back to Paris, and he needed to basically use propaganda to claim this as a victory. He left 38,000 basically soldiers of his own soldiers there in France to more or less deal with being stranded by themselves until they could possibly be rescued. But he took his own vessel with a handful of soldiers and returned to France, where it had already been written up by the newspapers, the propaganda, that not only had Napoleon taken Egypt, but that he was victorious against the Egyptians, the Ottomans, and he was returning as a hero. So again, this is where he used propaganda to a major effect. So the Egyptian campaign would be the major third reason for his rise to power.